Karoline Leavitt destroys liberal reporter after he refuses to back down. The room was buzzing with anticipation. The camera lights blazed down, casting a sterile glow across the set as the audience sat, captivated, ready for the next segment of the political talk show. The stage was set for a showdown, one that no one in the room could have predicted. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, poised and confident, dressed in a sharp blazer. She had been invited onto the program as a guest to discuss the latest political controversies surrounding her. What was supposed to be a simple discussion, however, was quickly turning into something much more. The liberal reporter, Mark Hastings, was prepared to make it anything but civil. Mark was known for his hard-hitting questions, his left-leaning views, and his willingness to challenge anyone who dared to speak in opposition to the prevailing narrative. His eyes locked on Karoline as the cameras began to roll. "Thank you for joining us, Karoline," Mark began, his voice smooth but with an underlying tone of mockery. "Let's start with something that's been on everyone's mind. Your recent comments about the government's spending, many argue they're out of touch with reality. Would you care to explain?" The tension in the room thickened immediately. Karoline, however, remained unfazed. She had been in the political arena long enough to know when to engage and when to let her words speak for themselves. She leaned forward, a calm but powerful presence. "You know, Mark," Karoline started, her voice steady but clear, "it's interesting you say that. I'm sure you believe those comments are out of touch, but the truth is," she paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. "The American people are hurting. They can't ignore the reality of inflation, of taxes rising, of a government that keeps pushing the burden onto the working class." Mark raised his eyebrows, a slight smirk on his face. He clearly wasn't ready to let her off so easily. "So, you're saying that the liberal policies are directly responsible for the struggles of the people? Isn't that a bit one-sided, Karoline? Doesn't your stance ignore the benefits of social safety nets and government intervention?" Karoline's eyes didn't flinch. She was ready for this. "Mark, let's talk about benefits, shall we?" Her tone sharpened. "How much is too much? When do we stop asking taxpayers to shoulder the load for policies that keep people in perpetual dependence on the government? What about the people who are working hard, who want to see change, who want to believe in the American dream? Are we just going to write them off as irrelevant?" Mark's face reddened, a flicker of irritation flashing across his features. "That's a typical right-wing talking point," he shot back. "This isn't about ignoring anyone, Karoline. It's about fairness. It's about helping those who need it most." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the cameras capturing every moment. Karoline took a breath and let the tension hang in the air. The audience was on the edge of their seats. "You talk about fairness, Mark," she said slowly, deliberately. "But you don't seem to understand that fairness isn't about taking from one group and giving it to another in the name of equality. It's about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. That's where this country has always thrived." Mark's expression hardened, his lips pressing together in a tight line. It was clear that he was used to having the upper hand in debates. But Karoline had managed to catch him off guard, challenging his narrative in a way that he hadn't expected. "You're a politician, Karoline," Mark scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Of course you'd say that. But can you back up your claims with actual evidence?" Karoline's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to back up what's obvious, Mark. The data speaks for itself. The more we expand government control, the more we stifle growth, innovation, and personal responsibility. The very things that made this country great." Mark's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, determined to make her back down. "You're completely dismissing the reality of systemic inequality, Karoline. You think you can just ignore the impact of policies that have historically oppressed certain groups?" Karoline's gaze sharpened. "I'm not ignoring anyone, Mark," she shot back, her voice cold. "But I do believe in personal accountability. I believe in the strength of individuals to rise above any challenge, no matter their background." The tension in the room was palpable now. Every word exchanged between Karoline and Mark seemed to add fuel to the fire. The audience was split, some nodding along with Karoline's words, others uncomfortable with the clash of ideologies unfolding before them. Mark, unwilling to let go of the battle, pressed on. So you're saying that inequality doesn't exist? That it's all a myth? He crossed his arms, daring her to continue. Karoline leaned in, her tone unwavering. No, Mark. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the answer to inequality isn't government handouts or more control. It's opportunity. It's freedom. That's the only way we lift people up. But you don't want to hear that, do you? Mark's face tightened, his grip on the desk clearly showing his frustration. You're dismissing people's real struggles, Karoline. And you're doing it all with a smile on your face. Karoline smiled back, her confidence undeterred. You can keep trying to paint me as the villain, Mark. But the truth is, she paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. I'm not here to please anyone. I'm here to speak for the people who are tired of the lies. The camera zoomed in on Karoline, capturing her composure as she stared Mark down. The audience was holding its breath, waiting for the next words to come. The stage was set. The battle was just beginning. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't going down without a fight. The tension in the studio was thick, but Mark wasn't done yet. Karoline had made her mark in the first round, but Mark had his sights set on making her trip up, pushing her to reveal a weakness. The cameras rolled, and the audience shifted in their seats, knowing this wasn't just a political discussion, it was a confrontation, one that could change the narrative of the entire show. Mark's voice cut through the silence, his tone more aggressive than before. It's funny, Karoline, how you talk about lifting people up, but where's the action? Where's the proof that your approach actually works? You claim that freedom is the answer, but what about all the people who've been left behind by your so-called opportunity? Are you really going to tell me that those who've faced systemic racism, poverty, and inequality just need more freedom? Karoline's jaw clenched for a moment, but her resolve never wavered. Mark, freedom is the foundation of this country. It's not about handouts, it's about allowing people to pursue their dreams, their goals, without the government standing in their way. Yes, I recognize that some face challenges, but the answer is not dependency. The answer is opportunity, the chance to build something for themselves. She paused, letting her words sink in. Mark shifted in his seat, his expression tight as he tried to compose himself. It was clear that Karoline's words were making an impact, but he was determined to keep the upper hand. Opportunity? Mark scoffed. Is that what you think people who've faced discrimination and injustice want to hear? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? It's easy for someone in your position to say that when you've never had to fight for basic rights or equal treatment. Karoline leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. I've worked hard for everything I have, Mark. I've faced challenges of my own, just like many others. And what I know is that the government isn't the solution to people's struggles. It's the belief that anyone, no matter their background, can rise to the top if they have the drive and the willpower to do so. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the intensity of the moment. The room was quiet, save for the sound of Karoline's voice as it carried through the space. People aren't powerless, Mark. They're capable. But the system that you support just keeps pushing them down, keeping them reliant on handouts and promises that will never be fulfilled. Mark's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, it seemed like he might interrupt, but he held his tongue. His eyes flickered to the teleprompter in front of him, searching for the next question, the next challenge. The clock was ticking, and he knew that the more he pressed, the more he risked being backed into a corner. But Karoline wasn't about to let him off the hook. She had been in this position before. You want proof, Mark? Look at the countries where liberal policies have dominated for years. Look at the people still stuck in poverty, still waiting for a miracle that the government has promised but never delivered. You want to talk about systemic problems? You want to talk about inequality? We've been promised change for decades, and where has it gotten us? Mark's eyes darkened. So now you're blaming everyone else but your own party? That's convenient, Karoline. Karoline didn't flinch. It's not about blaming anyone, Mark. It's about facing the truth. You can keep blaming others, or you can acknowledge that the answer to poverty, inequality, and injustice isn't more government intervention. It's giving people the power to change their own lives. Mark's frustration was palpable now. And how exactly do you plan to do that, Karoline? Do you honestly think you can just cut off support for the most vulnerable in society and expect everyone to magically rise to the top? Karoline's gaze never left him. What I'm saying is that government dependence isn't the solution. Empowering individuals is. Helping people create their own businesses, providing access to better education, encouraging a culture of entrepreneurship, that's how we lift people up. Not by creating more dependency, Mark. Not by promising people that they can't make it on their own. Mark shook his head, clearly irritated by her response. You're living in a fantasy world, Karoline. Your ideals sound nice in theory, but in reality, it's just not that simple. You can't just erase the deep-rooted issues that this country faces by pretending that everyone can succeed if they just work hard enough. Karoline's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no humor in it. I'm not pretending, Mark. I'm telling you the truth. The problem is that your policies create a culture of dependence, of entitlement. People are given just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. And that's where the system has failed. You can keep throwing money at the problem, but it's not going to solve anything. The camera zoomed out slightly, showing the exchange unfolding in front of the audience. Some were nodding along with Karoline, while others seemed less certain. Mark's face was a mask of frustration now. The liberal reporter, used to having control of the conversation, was starting to lose ground. Karoline, however, was just getting started. She knew the game he was playing, and she wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of the debate. As Mark opened his mouth to speak again, she interrupted him, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Mark, you can keep trying to undermine everything I say, but the facts are on my side. People don't need more government intervention. They need more opportunity. They need the chance to build something for themselves. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, he was at a loss for words. It was rare that anyone got the best of him in a debate, but Karoline had done it. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't about to let him control the narrative. The audience could feel the shift in energy. Karoline had made her point, and for now, the liberal reporter was left scrambling for a response. The cameras were rolling, capturing every tenth second of the exchange. And the battle was far from over. The lights seemed brighter now. The pressure was on. Mark could feel it. The once calm atmosphere had now transformed into an intense battleground. Karoline had thrown down the gauntlet, and she wasn't backing away. He needed to regain control, and fast. The audience could sense the shift in dynamics, with some cheering for Karoline's boldness while others remained firmly in Mark's camp. The debate had taken on a life of its own, and it was clear this wasn't going to be just another political interview. This was personal now. Mark leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the desk. Karoline, he began, his voice colder now, you talk a big game about opportunity and freedom. But let's be honest, those things are privileges that not everyone has. How can you sit there and act like those struggling with unemployment, with healthcare costs, with homelessness, are just going to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Karoline didn't flinch. I never said it would be easy, Mark. Life isn't easy for anyone. But the idea that the government should come in and fix every problem is a fallacy. People want to rise above their circumstances. They want the freedom to create their own solutions. If we keep fostering a culture of dependency, we'll never see real change. Mark's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he seemed to struggle for his next words. But then he found his footing, leaning in just a little further, as though hoping his proximity would unnerve her. So you think the poor, the homeless, the disenfranchised, those people should just figure it out? That's your solution? You're telling me that people who don't have access to basic necessities can just pull themselves up by their freedom? Karoline's expression hardened, but her voice remained calm, controlled. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that government shouldn't be the solution to every problem. We need policies that empower individuals, that give people a chance to work hard, to create their own opportunities. The American dream isn't about handouts, it's about having the chance to make your own destiny. Mark's face flushed red now. He was losing control. You're completely ignoring the systemic issues, Karoline. The rich get richer while the poor are left behind. Your policies are nothing but an excuse to protect the wealthy elite and leave everyone else to fend for themselves. Karoline didn't back down. She was poised, composed, her words cutting through the air with precision. That's a tired talking point, Mark. I'm not protecting the elite. I'm fighting for the everyday person who wants to work hard, who doesn't want to be told that they're incapable of achieving anything unless the government steps in. Mark scoffed, a derisive chuckle escaping his lips. And you think the working class is just going to magically improve by giving them more responsibility? What planet are you living on? Karoline's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. It's not about giving people more responsibility, it's about giving them the tools and the freedom to make decisions for themselves. The government is choking the life out of this country with its overreach, Mark. It's time we gave people the chance to create and thrive, without waiting for permission. The tension in the room was palpable now. Mark's fists clenched, and it was clear that his patience was wearing thin. He had expected Karoline to falter under pressure, to crack under the weight of his pointed questions. But she wasn't budging, and it was driving him insane. He needed to discredit her, to expose the flaws in her arguments, or else risk losing the entire debate. You're living in a fantasy, Karoline. Do you even understand what it's like for the people you're talking about? The ones who are struggling every single day just to get by. You're speaking in abstractions, and the reality is much harsher than you're willing to admit. Karoline's gaze never wavered. She had heard it all before, but this time, she had a response that would shift the narrative completely. I understand more than you think, Mark. I understand what it means to work hard and build something from the ground up. I know what it's like to face challenges and obstacles. But I also know that those challenges don't define us. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to keep playing the blame game, or are we going to empower people to rise above? Mark sat back, his frustration palpable. He had expected her to get rattled, to crumble under the weight of his questions. But instead, she was doubling down, standing firm in her beliefs. And the audience was starting to take notice. Karoline, sensing the shift in the room, decided to push even harder. You can keep trying to paint me as the villain, Mark. You can call my views extreme, but the truth is, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, almost challenging. The people who are suffering right now don't need another round of government assistance. They need the chance to stand on their own 2 feet. They need the tools to succeed, not a crutch. For a moment, the studio was silent. Mark was caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. The questions were no longer about policies or ideologies, they were about a fundamental belief in human resilience and the American dream. Karoline had made her case, and now it was up to Mark to try and retake control of the debate. The silence stretched on as the audience waited for his next move. But Karoline was already 2 steps ahead, confident in her convictions, ready for whatever Mark might throw at her next. The stage was set for the next round of this epic political clash, and Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to let it slip away. The studio felt like a pressure cooker now. The air was thick with anticipation. The audience, once divided, seemed to be leaning more toward Karoline, captivated by her unwavering stance. Mark Hastings, who had always been in control of these discussions, was now visibly rattled. His attempt to hold the upper hand had faltered, and the next move was crucial. He had to land a blow, something that would turn the tide in his favor. But Karoline wasn't about to give him that opportunity. She leaned back in her chair, the confidence emanating from her like a shield. It was clear to everyone watching that she had been prepared for this. She wasn't just arguing policies, she was fighting for a vision of the future that she believed in deeply. And that was what made her so formidable. She wasn't just defending her views, she was living them. Mark's mind raced, trying to find a way to regain control. He scanned the audience, their eyes fixed on him, and he realized this was his moment to either reclaim the narrative or lose the debate entirely. His gaze hardened, and he steeled himself for a more aggressive approach. "Let's talk about your tools to succeed, Karoline," Mark began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What exactly are you offering people who can barely make ends meet? You think a little freedom is going to magically solve decades of economic disparity and social injustice? What kind of tools are you talking about here? A job? A loan? Is that really your big solution?" Karoline's expression didn't change. She had expected this. Mark's attack was predictable. He was trying to paint her as out of touch, as someone who had no understanding of real struggle. But Karoline was no stranger to these kinds of questions. She had heard them 1,000 times before, and she had a response ready. "I'm offering opportunity, Mark," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "Opportunity to create, to innovate, to grow. The tools I'm talking about are the same ones that built this country: the opportunity to start a business, to invest in education, to create a better future for yourself and your family. The government should be an enabler, not a crutch." Mark scoffed. "Oh, right. Just let everyone start a business, huh? Tell that to the millions of people who can barely afford rent, let alone start their own company. You're talking about a fantasy, Karoline. A pipe dream. You're completely disconnected from the reality of most Americans." Karoline didn't flinch. "It's not a fantasy, Mark. It's about creating an environment where people can rise. When the government gets out of the way and lets the free market work, opportunities start to flourish. It's about breaking the chains of dependence and giving people the power to create their own success. That's the American way." Mark's patience was wearing thin. His face was flushed with frustration, and his eyes burned with the desire to have the last word. He leaned forward, his voice low but forceful. "You want to talk about the American way, Karoline? Let's talk about that. The reality is, the American way hasn't worked for everyone. It's worked for the rich, for the powerful, for those at the top of the food chain. But for everyone else, it's been a struggle. And you want to keep talking about opportunity as if it's a one-size-fits-all solution?" Karoline's lips curled into a slight smile. "The American way has worked for millions of people, Mark. It's worked for people who came from nothing and built empires. It's worked for those who faced adversity and found ways to overcome it. The system isn't perfect, but it's the best system the world has ever known. And the answer isn't more government control, it's more opportunity." Mark's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "So, what? You think we should just leave the poor behind? Let them fend for themselves while the rich get richer? Is that your solution?" Karoline shook her head slowly, her voice steady. "No, Mark. That's not what I'm saying at all. But the truth is, government handouts don't solve anything. They just create a cycle of dependency. What we need is to focus on creating opportunities, not just giving people a fish, but teaching them how to fish. It's about empowering individuals to rise above their circumstances, not keeping them stuck in the system." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Mark, clearly rattled by her argument, tried to regain some sense of composure. He paused for a moment, as if searching for a new line of attack. "You talk about opportunity," Mark said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But what about the people who don't have the means to take advantage of that opportunity? The people who don't have access to education, who can't get a loan to start a business, who are stuck in a system that's rigged against them. How does your freedom solve that?" Karoline's eyes softened for a moment, but her resolve remained firm. "The answer isn't more government programs, Mark. The answer is empowering people to take control of their own futures. It's about breaking down the barriers that prevent people from achieving their full potential. It's about creating an environment where hard work and determination can lead to success, no matter where you start. Mark scoffed. That's easy for you to say, Karoline. You've had the privilege of being in a position where you've had access to resources, to opportunities. But what about the people who haven't had that chance? Karoline leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. I know what it's like to struggle, Mark. I didn't come from a wealthy family. I didn't have everything handed to me. But I had the chance to build something. And that's what I'm fighting for, the chance for everyone to have that same opportunity. Not just the lucky few, but everyone. The audience was now in a state of electric tension. Mark could feel the room shifting. He had lost some ground, but he wasn't ready to concede. His next words came out with a biting edge. You want to talk about opportunity, Karoline, but what happens when the system you're defending just perpetuates inequality? What happens when the people you claim to be fighting for are still left behind, still struggling, despite all the opportunities you say are available? Karoline stood tall, her gaze unwavering. The system needs reform, Mark. But that doesn't mean we abandon it. It means we work to make it better, to make it fairer. And we start by trusting the American people, not treating them like they're incapable of creating their own success. Mark was silent for a moment, clearly flustered. Karoline had landed another powerful blow. He had underestimated her from the start, and now it was clear that she wasn't going to be easily silenced. The confrontation had reached its boiling point, and it was clear to everyone watching that this debate was far from over. The camera zoomed in on Karoline, capturing her unshakable confidence. Mark, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling to regroup, his mind racing for something, anything, that could challenge the narrative Karoline had established. The battle was reaching its climax, and it was anyone's guess who would come out on top. But one thing was certain, Karoline Leavitt wasn't backing down. And Mark Hastings was running out of time. The moment had arrived. The exchange had escalated to a point where there was no going back. Karoline stood firm, her words landing with precision, while Mark, increasingly rattled, was trying desperately to salvage his position. The studio audience could sense the shift in the dynamic. This wasn't just another political debate, it had become a battle of wills. The cameras focused on Karoline as she maintained her composure, her face calm, but her eyes sharp with determination. She had weathered the storm of Mark's accusations, and now it was time for her to land the final blow. But Mark wasn't done. He wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. He took a deep breath, his voice shaking slightly as he continued, "You keep talking about opportunity, Karoline, but you're completely ignoring the reality. How can you claim that people just need freedom when they're shackled by debt, by healthcare costs, by a system that's rigged against them from the start?" Karoline didn't flinch. "I'm not ignoring the problems, Mark. What I'm saying is that the government isn't the solution to everything. It's the system of dependency you keep promoting that's keeping people stuck. What people need is a chance to get ahead, not just a safety net that catches them and keeps them from ever reaching for more." Mark's face twisted with frustration. He was losing ground fast, and the cameras were catching every moment. "You keep saying that, but the people who are suffering, Karoline, they need more than just a chance. They need real help. They need the government to step in and provide support." Karoline's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a flash of something in her gaze, something almost daring. "And that's where you're wrong, Mark," she said, her voice laced with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. "The government isn't supposed to be the answer to everything. It's supposed to create a fair playing field and get out of the way. You're talking about Band-Aid solutions, but I'm talking about long-term change. You want to fix the system by throwing more money at it, but that's just perpetuating the problem." Mark opened his mouth, about to retort, but Karoline cut him off, her voice sharper now. "What you're failing to see is that people are more than capable of creating their own futures. The government doesn't need to hand them everything, it needs to empower them. The people who are suffering don't need to be told they can't make it. They need to be shown how they can break free from the system that's holding them back. The tension in the room was palpable now. The audience, once divided, was beginning to shift, caught in the power of Karoline's conviction. Mark's face was red, his frustration mounting. He could feel the ground slipping beneath him, and for a brief moment he seemed at a loss for words. The silence stretched on. Karoline, sensing her opening, pressed on. Look at the history of this country, Mark. We didn't become the most powerful nation in the world by depending on the government for everything. We became great by fostering a culture of self-reliance, innovation, and individual responsibility. That's what I'm fighting for, a system that allows people to rise above their circumstances. Not one that keeps them trapped in a cycle of government dependence. Mark, his grip on the desk tightening, finally broke the silence, his voice shaky but intense. You're delusional, Karoline. You're ignoring the fact that systemic inequality still exists. You're ignoring the reality that people who don't have the same opportunities or the same starting points can't just rise above on their own. Your system doesn't work for everyone, and that's the problem. Karoline leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. I'm not ignoring it, Mark. I'm acknowledging it. But the answer isn't to keep people stuck in the system you've created. The answer is to give them the freedom to succeed on their own terms. The room was dead silent, the audience hanging on her every word. Karoline had delivered a clear, unshakable message, and the intensity of her argument was undeniable. Mark opened his mouth, but the words seemed to fail him. He had no immediate response, no comeback that could counter the force of Karoline's position. He had been backed into a corner, and the cameras caught the brief flicker of realization on his face. For a split second, it seemed as though Karoline had won. She had taken control of the debate, and Mark was left scrambling for something, anything to say. But then, as if trying to claw his way back to the spotlight, Mark finally spoke, though his voice now lacked the power it had earlier. You're just too idealistic, Karoline. The world doesn't work like that. You can't just wish away the problems that exist. You can't pretend that everyone has the same opportunities or the same access to resources. Karoline's expression softened slightly, but her resolve was as strong as ever. I'm not pretending, Mark. I'm fighting for something better. I'm fighting for a future where people don't have to rely on the government to survive. A future where people can create their own success, where their potential isn't limited by the government but empowered by it. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but it was too late. The room had shifted, the energy had changed, and it was clear that Karoline had won this round. The camera zoomed out, capturing the frustration in Mark's face as Karoline sat back, her composure unwavering, her victory secure, for now. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the host stepping in to change the topic. The battle was over, for the moment, but the damage had been done. Karoline had dismantled Mark's arguments with precision, and now, the audience knew exactly where she stood. The tension between them would simmer, but Karoline Leavitt had emerged as the clear victor in this exchange. And as the cameras continued to roll, one thing was clear: Karoline had not only destroyed Mark's argument, she had redefined the debate.